It was Melissa's birthday dinner, and I had driven 40 minutes through rain to be there. I had flowers. I had a card. I had spent 3 weeks choosing a gift. A first-edition novel she'd once mentioned in passing, the kind of detail only a sister who actually listens would remember. I sat at the end of the table in a blue wrap dress I'd bought on sale, quietly proud of myself for making the effort. Then Dad stood up with his champagne flute. "To Melissa," he said, his voice warm and full. "The most beautiful woman in this family. The one who lights up every room she walks into." He looked directly at her the entire time. Everyone did. Melissa laughed and covered her face like she was embarrassed by the attention, but she wasn't. She never was. She tilted her chin just slightly so the candlelight caught her cheekbones. Smiled. Clap. I even raised my glass. But my mother leaned over and whispered, not quite quietly enough, "Don't look so stiff, Sarah. Try to enjoy yourself." As if the problem in the room was my posture. That was the moment I understood something I'd been too hopeful to admit. No matter what I built, what I achieved, or who I became, in this family I would always be the backdrop. The reliable, forgettable backdrop. And I was done pretending that didn't hurt. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Before the story continues, take a second to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Here we share true-to-life revenge stories where the ignored, humiliated, and betrayed rise quietly, and make it count. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and hearing from you directly. One important note, some elements in this story have been fictionalized for educational and storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or settings is coincidental. That being said, the message I'm sharing is meaningful, and I hope it speaks to you. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened to me. My name is Sarah. I am the older daughter, the firstborn, the one my parents called their steady one. A title that sounds like a compliment until you understand what it really means. It means, the one we don't have to worry about. The one who will figure it out. The one who will survive. I grew up in a beige house in a quiet suburb. The kind of neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawns on Saturdays and left casseroles on the porch when someone had surgery. My father ran an accounting firm. My mother collected cookbooks she never cooked from and managed their investment portfolio with a precision she never applied to her parenting. I was a reader, a planner, a girl who kept her room clean and finished her homework before dinner. My teachers called me diligent. My relatives called me mature. My mother called me easy. Nobody called me remarkable. Nobody saw the version of me that existed in my own mind, the woman who had opinions worth hearing, ambitions worth honoring, a voice worth amplifying. They were all too busy watching Melissa's next act to look for the quiet girl in the corner of the frame. I was always in the corner, always watching, and I was learning far more than any of them realized. Melissa was born into the spotlight the way some people are born with perfect pitch. Effortlessly, completely, as if the universe had prearranged it. She had our mother's beauty and our father's charm, and she understood at age 7 what most politicians never figure out. That presence is its own form of power. She cried dramatically. She laughed loudly. She wanted things and asked for them and usually received them. Our parents called it passion. I called it a pattern I was slowly being trained to accommodate. By the time I was 14 and she was 11, the architecture of our family was already cemented. Melissa was the story. I was the setting. I watched her get pulled out of the consequences of things I would have been grounded for a month over. A broken curfew became a family conversation about respecting Melissa's social development. A failed exam became a crisis requiring tutors our parents charged to a credit card they'd never offered for my extracurriculars. A tantrum at a family dinner became evidence of how sensitive she was, how deeply she felt things. And me. I felt things deeply too. I just never made anyone else suffer for it. That was my first mistake, I think. Suffering quietly in a family that only rewarded suffering loudly. I had been taught that restraint was virtue. What I hadn't been taught was that sometimes, restraint just makes you invisible. I was 14 when I learned that nothing I owned was really mine. For 3 months, I woke up at 6 in the morning every Saturday to open the bookstore where I worked a part-time shift shelving returns and ringing up customers who bought things they'd probably leave on nightstands unread. I saved every check with the focus of someone twice my age. I had a goal. A vintage green dress in the window of a second-hand boutique 2 blocks from school. It had a Peter Pan collar and tiny pearl buttons down the back, and it made me feel, even on the hanger, like someone I wanted to become. I bought it on a Thursday. I hung it in my closet with the tags still on, saving it for homecoming. On Friday, I came home from school to an empty hanger. My mother was in the kitchen making tea. "Melissa needed something for the Harrison party tonight," she said without looking up. I told her she could borrow it. "You can always get another one." I stood in the doorway of my bedroom for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there, feeling the shape of something I couldn't yet name. It wasn't about the dress. It was about the assumption, the quiet, practiced assumption, that my things, my efforts, my sacrifices were available resources for anyone who needed them more dramatically than I did. I filed that feeling away. I would need it later. I met David at a marketing conference in Chicago when I was 29. He was presenting on digital strategy, and I was in the third row taking notes in a leather notebook I'd carried since graduate school. When the Q&A opened, I raised my hand and offered a counterpoint to one of his frameworks. Politely, precisely, with evidence. He paused. And then he did something that undid something inside me. He actually considered what I'd said. Not dismissed it. Not smiled through it. He leaned into the microphone and said, "That's a better observation than anything I put in my slides." We had coffee after the session. Then dinner. Then we talked on the phone for 2 hours after I got back to my hotel room. What I remember most about those early months with David was not the romance, though there was romance, but the sensation of being met. He asked me questions and waited for my full answer. He remembered what I'd said the week before and referenced it the week after. He celebrated my promotions with the kind of enthusiasm my parents reserved for Melissa's auditions. I had spent nearly 3 decades becoming someone I was proud of, quietly, without an audience. David was the first person who made me feel like the audience had arrived. I fell in love with him the way I did most things, completely, carefully, and with my whole self. I had no reason to believe that would become my undoing. We got engaged on a Tuesday night on the roof of a restaurant that overlooked the river, and for approximately 6 days, the happiness was clean and uncomplicated. Then I called my mother. She said she was thrilled, she said David was wonderful, and then, in the same breath without pausing, she said, "You'll want to keep Melissa in mind when you're planning. She's going through something." Melissa was always going through something. Wedding planning with my family meant navigating a minefield where every step I took had to be checked against Melissa's emotional coordinates. The date I'd chosen was too close to her most recent breakup anniversary. The blush bridesmaid dresses I'd fallen in love with were insensitive, because of something I've since blocked out. My choice of venue, a vineyard with light-soaked windows and wooden floors, was somehow adjacent to a memory Melissa had of an ex. I held firm on every single point. For the first time in my adult life, I refused to rearrange my joy around her grief. The wedding was mine. It was beautiful. The photographs still make me catch my breath. But looking back, I can see what I missed. The pattern was still running. My mother was still managing Melissa's feelings through me, still using me as the shock absorber for our family's dysfunction. I had started to set boundaries, yes. I had not yet understood that some patterns run deeper than boundaries alone can reach. For 3 years after the wedding, I lived inside a life I had built entirely by my own design. The house was ours, a craftsman bungalow an hour from my parents, with a garden David had planted from seed and a home office where I'd started taking freelance consulting clients on evenings and weekends. The neighborhood was quiet. The mornings were mine. I maintained what my therapist would later call healthy distance from my family. I attended holidays. I sent birthday cards with handwritten notes. I called on Sunday afternoons and kept the conversations to 45 minutes. Long enough to be present, short enough to protect my peace. Melissa, I heard, had settled into something resembling stability. A man named Marcus, a waitressing job at an upscale downtown restaurant, a yoga teacher certification she was completing. I felt cautious relief the way you feel cautious relief when a storm that's been threatening all week seems to be tracking away from you. You don't relax entirely. You just breathe a little easier. My consulting business was growing faster than I'd projected. I'd taken on 3 anchor clients in 18 months and built systems efficient enough to handle more. I worked hard and I slept well and I loved my husband and I genuinely thought, that I had finally outrun the version of myself who accepted less than she deserved. I had not outrun anything. I had simply not been looking in the right direction. The text came while I was sitting across from a client, nodding along to a presentation about Q4 projections I'd already reviewed. My phone was face down on the conference table. Felt it vibrate. I ignored it. Vibrated again. I excused myself at the break and read it in the hallway, standing under a flickering fluorescent light next to a fire extinguisher that would later feel symbolic. Unknown number. 8 words. Asterisk check your husband's phone. Park Hotel, room 412. Asterisk. Then a second message. Asterisk every Tuesday. 6 months. Asterisk. I stood very still. The rational part of my brain was already assembling alternative explanations. Spam, a wrong number, someone with a grudge against David professionally. The irrational part of my brain, the ancient animal part that lives below language, had already arrived at the truth and was sitting with it quietly, waiting for the rest of me to catch up. I returned to the conference room. I finished the meeting. I shook hands with 3 different people and said, absolutely, and we'll follow up by Friday, and smiled with every muscle in my face while something inside me was standing perfectly still in the eye of something I did not yet have words for. On the drive home I did not turn on the radio. I drove in silence, thinking about nothing, the way you do when you already know the answer and are deciding whether you're ready to ask the question. I waited until he was in the shower. Took me 45 seconds to find what I was looking for. I sat on the cold bathroom floor with my back against the wall, and I read through 8 months of text messages while steam crept under the door and condensed on my arms. The messages started casually. The easy, practiced casualness of 2 people pretending something is nothing. Then they stopped pretending. There were photographs. I won't describe them. There were plans, specific and logistical, woven into the architecture of our shared calendar with the care of someone who had thought carefully about what wouldn't be questioned. Tuesday client lunch. The networking event. The overtime that I had never once doubted because why would I doubt it? He had never given me reason to doubt it. I read every message. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to understand the full geography of it before I could decide where to stand. Maybe I needed to feel the entire weight of it so I would never, in a weak moment later, minimize what had been done to me. When I finished, I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it. I stood up. I looked at my reflection in the fogged mirror. Hair undone, face composed, eyes doing something I didn't have a name for yet. I walked to the living room. I poured a glass of water. I sat down. I made no sound at all. It wasn't the affair that broke me. Affairs, as devastating as they are, happen between strangers. Between people with no architecture between them but desire. What broke me was the contact name. Red Heart. I had that number memorized. I'd had it memorized since I was in my 20s, punched into my phone under Melissa, with a little flower emoji she'd asked me to add one Christmas Eve when we were both slightly wine-warm and almost close. I texted that number on her birthdays. I texted it when Dad had a health scare. I'd texted it the night David proposed, because even with everything between us I had thought, she is still my sister. Some things still mean something. She had texted that same number from hotel rooms. I sat with that fact for 3 days before I said a word to anyone. 3 days of cooking dinner and answering emails and holding client calls and existing inside the life I'd built as if it were still intact, as if I hadn't been watching it from the outside since that Thursday afternoon. I needed those 3 days. Not to grieve. Grief would come later, in installments. I needed them to understand who I was becoming in response to this moment. I had a choice, and I wanted to make it deliberately, not reactively. I had spent too many years reacting to Melissa's chaos. This time I would decide my next move with both eyes open. When I finally confronted David, I didn't raise my voice. I had rehearsed the scene 100 times in my head with screaming and broken dishes, and then I decided against all of it. Screaming gives other people something to respond to. Silence makes them sit inside what they've done. I set his phone on the kitchen table between us. I sat down. I looked at him. He looked at the phone. He looked at me. And something in his face, some last thin wall of denial, quietly collapsed. "How long?" I said. Not a question. Ledger entry. 8 months, he said to the table. He nodded. 8 months of Tuesdays. 8 months of a parallel life. 8 months of coming home to me and sleeping in our bed and eating the dinners I made and asking about my clients and saying he loved me. 8 months of all of it while building something secret in a hotel room with my sister. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. I remember thinking, what an extraordinary thing to say. As if intention were absolution. As if accidentally setting a house on fire made the ash any less real. I didn't respond to that. There was nothing worth saying. I stood up, walked to our bedroom and closed the door. I had already begun making a list. My parents arrived at my house 2 days after I called them. I'd been careful and precise on the phone. Just the facts, no emotion, the way you deliver a briefing when you're afraid that feeling too much will cost you the clarity you need. They sat on my couch. I sat across from them. I watched their faces move through the information the way a weather system moves through a valley. Shock, then softening, then something that looked horribly like management. My father said, "These things happen." I heard those words and felt something calcify inside me. My mother said that Melissa was scared. That the baby was going to need stability. That what mattered now was how we handled this as a family. I asked what I needed. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable for them. It was so practiced it was almost graceful. The practiced silence of people who had spent decades not asking that question. I didn't cry. I had already cried alone in the shower at 5 in the morning, where the hot water and the closed door gave me permission to feel what I couldn't feel in front of an audience. I had already done the collapsing. What sat in that living room with my parents was not a broken woman. It was a woman who had just been given her last, clearest, most irrefutable piece of evidence. I did not need to be angry. I needed to move. I'm going to tell you something that took me years of therapy and hard solitude to understand. The moment you stop expecting someone to finally see your worth is the moment you stop needing them to. I sat in my car outside my parents' house after that conversation for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard without counting, just watching the numbers change the way you watch a river from a bridge. Not trying to measure it, just witnessing it move. Then I started the car. I did not cry on the drive home. I did not call a friend to process what I was feeling. I drove in silence and I made, quietly and completely, the most important decision of my adult life. Enough. Not said in anger. Not said in desperation. Said with the clear, still certainty of a woman who had finally arrived at the outer limit of what she would carry for other people. I was done being the one who absorbed the chaos. Done being the one whose feelings were the least urgent in any room. Done rearranging my life to accommodate the comfort of people who had never once lost sleep worrying about mine. I would not fight. I would not beg. I would not scream into the void of their indifference. I would build something they could not take from me. And I would begin immediately. I called an attorney on a Monday morning. By Friday, the divorce papers had been filed. David did not contest them. I think part of him was relieved, the way people are relieved when a secret finally surfaces and the exhausting work of hiding it is over. I sold the house. I took my half of everything that was mine and left behind everything that wasn't, including the wedding photographs, which I neither kept nor destroyed. I simply left them in a drawer, the way you leave something in a drawer when you're not ready to decide what it means. I moved into a downtown loft on the 14th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick, and a kitchen I would eventually learn to love cooking in alone. The first night I spent there I ordered takeout, sat on the floor because my furniture hadn't arrived, and watched the city lights below me without thinking anything in particular. People expect devastation to have a dramatic texture. They expect it to look like falling apart. But sometimes devastation is quiet. Sometimes it's just sitting on a bare floor in an empty apartment while the city moves on below you without requiring anything from you. No one needed me to be strong that night. No one needed me to be anything at all. I sat there in the silence until I realized the silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. The first truly empty space I had owned in my entire adult life. I decided to fill it carefully. Within a month, I had converted the second bedroom of the loft into an office. Within 3 months, I had doubled my consulting client base. Within 6 months, I had hired my first employee, a sharp, no-nonsense operations manager named Diane who ran systems the way a conductor runs an orchestra, everything in time, nothing wasted. I worked with the kind of focused intensity that only becomes available to you when you've cleared the emotional clutter from every corner of your life. I wasn't working to prove something to David. I wasn't working to prove something to Melissa or my parents. I was working because I had always been capable of this and had simply never given myself an unobstructed run at it. I was good at this. I was better than good. I understood what companies needed before they understood it themselves. I had the instincts of someone who had spent her entire life observing the space between what people said and what they actually meant. The clients started referring other clients. My calendar filled 12 weeks out. I raised my rates and the inquiries kept coming. There's a particular feeling that comes with building something real. Not the giddy feeling of early success, but the deeper, steadier feeling of a foundation setting. I could feel it happening beneath me like concrete curing, quiet and absolute. I had never felt it before. Now I understood why people chase it their whole lives. I started therapy not because I was falling apart. I had already done that privately on schedule and moved through it, but because I wanted to understand how I had arrived at 40 years old still letting other people define the perimeter of my worth. Dr. Martinez had silver-streaked hair and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the most interesting problem she'd ever encountered. She didn't offer comfort as a reflex. She offered clarity, which I found far more useful. She said something in our 4th session that I've carried like a stone in my pocket ever since. You spent so many years being the supporting character in other people's stories that you forgot you were allowed to be the heroine of your own. I sat with that. I argued with it too. I'd been building my own life, hadn't I? My business, my marriage, my apartment. But she pushed back gently. Building a life and claiming authorship of your own story are different things. You were building, yes. But you were still letting them narrate you. We worked on the patterns. The dress. The birthday dinner. The wedding planning. The marriage I'd kept trusting despite an accumulation of small moments I had talked myself out of calling red flags. I wasn't the problem. But I had been a participant in a system that made the problem possible. Understanding the difference was not about blame. It was about never walking into that system again. Word travels in small families the way smoke travels through an old house. Not through doors you leave open, but through every invisible gap in the architecture. I heard about Melissa and David in pieces, through people I hadn't asked and information I hadn't sought. David lost his job about 8 months after the divorce. Something about expense report irregularities, money redirected from a client account that, as it turned out, had never existed. The prestigious Peterson Industries campaign he'd supposedly been nurturing during all those Tuesday afternoons. Fiction. An elaborate fiction. Expense to his company and apparently to the marriage, too. Without his salary, the romance between David and Melissa metabolized quickly. She had a daughter, Sophie, a fact I received without the vindication I'd expected to feel. I felt only the dull ache of watching a child arrive into chaos that was not her fault. David, confronted with child support and the daily reality of accountability, began the slow fade. Missed visits became no visits. Last anyone heard, he had relocated to another state to, as he'd apparently told a mutual friend, start over. I did not feel glad. I want to be careful about that because the easy narrative would have me savoring their collapse. I didn't. I felt sad. The specific, clean sadness of someone watching a preventable wreckage from a safe distance, knowing that nothing they could have done would have stopped it. Some people are not capable of the life they want until they have fully lived the life they insist on. David and Melissa were those people. It came out 18 months after the divorce. during a conversation that started as Sunday dinner and ended as the hardest thing I have ever had to sit with. My mother was washing dishes. I was drying them. It was the most domestic, ordinary scene. The kind of scene that makes you lower your guard precisely because nothing about it signals what is coming. She said quietly, not looking at me, "I knew before you did." I set down the glass I was holding very carefully. She had noticed, she said, the way Melissa talked about David. A text she'd seen on Melissa's phone by accident, 3 months before I received the anonymous message. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself that confronting it would destroy the family. She had told herself that maybe she was wrong. She had told herself a great many things. "I should have told you," she said. "I keep thinking about what would have been different if I had." I stood in her kitchen for a long time without speaking. My mother, not Melissa, not David, but my mother, had held the piece of information that might have saved me 4 months of a marriage I was already living outside of, and had chosen to protect the family system instead of me. The betrayal wasn't new. It was just finally visible. The difference between those two things is the difference between a wound and a scar. I dried the last glass. I set it on the shelf. I said, "I know." 'Cause I had always known. I had just not let myself say it out loud. 6 months after the kitchen confession, my father called me at work and asked me to come to the house that evening. He sounded different, older, quieter, as if something large had been settled in his chest and the settling had cost him. I arrived to find both of my parents in the living room, surrounded by papers, bank statements, legal documents, a police report with Melissa's name in the subject line. The story came out in pieces. Forged checks, credit card charges they'd attributed to memory lapses until the amounts became impossible to explain. A loan taken against the house using documents Melissa had apparently signed on their behalf. Mum's jewelry, Dad's watch collection, family heirlooms removed from their home over the course of a year, quietly, during Sunday dinners and holiday visits. She had been stealing from them with the same fluency she'd stolen everything else. My dress, my spotlight, my husband, counting on their love to keep them from looking too closely at what was missing. They had filed a police report. They had changed the locks and closed joint accounts. And now, sitting across from me with shaking hands and 40 years of regret between them, they were apologizing for things they'd been doing my whole life without understanding they were doing it. My father cried. I had never seen my father cry. "We failed you," he said. Simply, specifically, without qualification. I had waited 37 years to hear those words. They didn't feel the way I'd imagined. They felt like the start of something rather than the end. They handed me a folder. Inside the folder were updated estate documents, trust information, and financial statements that took me 3 attempts to fully process. My parents had, over decades of careful, quiet investment, accumulated a fortune none of us had known the true size of. Dad's accounting firm had grown into a regional institution before he sold it for far more than we'd realized. My mother's stock picks, made methodically without fanfare in the early morning hours before anyone else was awake, had compounded into something extraordinary. They drove modest cars. They had the same kitchen appliances for 15 years. They gave nothing away through their lifestyle about what was quietly growing in their accounts. The number at the bottom of the final page. $37 million. And they were leaving all of it to me. I sat in their living room holding papers that represented everything their lives had accumulated, and I felt, strangely, unexpectedly, calm. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. This was not a prize. It was a reckoning. A formal acknowledgement of a truth that had always existed but never been said aloud. That I was the daughter who had built rather than borrowed. Who had earned rather than extracted. Who had chosen something real when nothing required her to. I looked at my father. He was still watching me. "Thank you," I said. It was the only thing I had. She came on a Tuesday night. Of course it was a Tuesday. 11:30. The porch light was on because I always left the porch light on, which was not an invitation, but she took it as one anyway. I heard the buzzer and looked through the intercom, and there she was. Mascara tracking lines down her face, designer dress wrinkled and stained, a pregnant belly I had not known about pushing against the fabric. She looked like someone had removed everything that had always protected her from consequence, and set her down naked in the cold. I stood in my apartment for a full 60 seconds before I answered. In those 60 seconds I ran through every version of this moment I had imagined over the years. The version where I was cruel, the version where I was magnanimous, the version where I said everything I'd saved up, the version where I said nothing at all. Then I went to the door. She was living in her car. David had disappeared again. Their second child, another decision made at the intersection of crisis and bad judgment, was due in 6 weeks. She had called our parents first. They had threatened to call the police. She stood on my porch and said, "I have nowhere else to go." I looked at her for a long time. Not with hatred. Not with triumph. With a clear, level gaze of someone who has finally learned the difference between cruelty and clarity. "I know," I said. She said everything she had. She arranged her arguments the way she had always arranged her life. By emotional force, by proximity to innocence, by the weaponization of people who couldn't speak for themselves. She said the children were innocent. She was right about that. She said I had always been cold, selfish, heartless. That David had come to her because of who I was. I let those words arrive and I examined them honestly, the way Dr. Martinez had taught me to. Not defensively, not dismissively, but with the genuine inquiry of a woman who is done confusing discomfort with truth. They weren't true. "I'm sorry you're in this situation," I said. And I meant it. Not as performance. Not as cruelty dressed as civility. I was genuinely sorry. For Sophie, for the unborn child, for the long shadow of consequences that Melissa had spent a lifetime pulling toward herself. But this isn't mine to fix. She called me heartless. The word hit the wall behind me and fell. "There are resources," I said. "Shelters. Assistance programs for single mothers. I can give you those numbers if you want them." She screamed something I've since let myself forget. Closed the door. Gently. Turned the deadbolt. Walked to the living room and poured a glass of wine and sat in the quiet that I had built over years of deliberate, costly choices. The wine was good. The quiet was better. 6 months after I closed that door, I was in a conference room in Seattle signing documents that established the Sarah Matthews Foundation for Women's Entrepreneurship. The foundation would provide grants, mentoring, and operational resources to women rebuilding their lives through their own labor. Women who had survived the version of invisibility I had survived, who had faced the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by the people closest to them, and who had decided to build something anyway. Diane, my operations manager, had helped design the grant criteria. We argued warmly over language. She wanted resilience in the mission statement and I pushed back, because I was tired of resilience being the word we used to describe what we did with damage. I wanted the word deserving. I wanted women to know they didn't have to survive something first. They simply deserved. We compromised on both. The first cohort of grant recipients was 12 women. A single mother who'd left a bad marriage and was building a bakery. A woman in her 50s starting over after a layoff. A young woman, 24, who'd aged out of foster care and was building a logistics company from a shared workspace. At the first luncheon, I stood at a podium and looked out at 200 women and told them the truth. That the most radical thing any of us can do is simply refuse to accept less than we deserve. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just firmly. Just completely. Just like that. My parents hosted a small dinner party last spring. It was nothing elaborate. 6 guests, good wine, the kind of evening my mother calls intimate and means warmly. My father stood up to give a toast. He looked at me the whole time. He talked about watching me build something from nothing, about the consulting firm and the foundation and the quiet dignity with which I'd handled things he was ashamed to have made necessary. He used the word remarkable. He used the word proud. He looked directly at me and said, "You are the extraordinary one. You always were. We were too blind to see it, and I am sorry it took us this long." I sat at the head of that table. My parents' table, the same table where I had sat at the far end through 30 years of birthday dinners and holiday meals and endless toasts to a sister who had lit up every room while I'd kept the lights on, and I received those words. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. This was the mirror of that first birthday dinner. The same table. The same family. But the frame had shifted entirely, and inside it stood a version of me I had built alone, through the particular alchemy of loss and labor and learning what I was worth without anyone's permission. James, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table. I squeezed back. This was the moment the story turned. Quietly. Irrevocably. This was the one no one could take back. I live on the side of a hill now, in a house that is modest for what I could afford and exactly right for who I am. There's a balcony that faces west, and in the evenings when the light is doing what evening light does over a city, painting everything gold before it lets the dark come in, I sit out there with a glass of wine and I think. Not about Melissa. She is out there somewhere, presumably building towards something more sustainable than what she built before. Hope she is. I genuinely, calmly, completely hope she is. Not about David. He is irrelevant to the story I'm living now. I think about the girl who sat at the end of that table. The one who clapped and raised her glass and smiled while her father described her sister as the most beautiful woman in the family. The one who filed every small injustice away in a quiet part of herself and decided, instead of breaking, to become someone who couldn't be broken. I think about what it costs to be that girl. And what it earns. Patience is not passivity. Silence is not weakness. Choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is the most honest thing you can do for yourself and for everyone who will eventually need you to be whole. The best revenge is not a plan. It is a life. A real one. One you built in the dark, without applause, without acknowledgement, before anyone was watching. By the time they look up, you're already there. And the view from here is extraordinary. If this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel for more true stories like this one. Leave a comment below, telling me what you would have done in my situation. I read every single one. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your share might encourage someone. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know this wasn't an easy story to hear, and I want to be honest with you, some of the stories that follow contain fictionalized elements created for educational purposes. If you're willing to learn from real experiences, even painful ones, I'll be here sharing what I've learned. God bless you. And remember, protecting what is yours is never an option.